Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Rabbi Alex Chapper of Borehamwood Elstree Synagogue, and we're delighted to be hosting this event in conjunction with Bushy United Synagogue, the Jewish Organ Donor Association, and the United Synagogue. Tonight we'll be exploring medical and Jewish responses to the new organ donation law. Now, as you may be aware, organ donation in England has moved to an opt-out system. You may also hear it referred to as Max and Kira's law. And this means that all adults in England will be considered to have agreed to be an organ donor when they pass away, unless they've recorded the decision not to donate and are in one of the excluded groups. It's important to note that families will still be approached about faith, beliefs, and culture will continue to be respected. You still have a choice about whether or not you wish to become a donor. From a Halachic perspective, what should we do? Opt in or opt out? Now, to understand the complex medical and Jewish issues, we have a world-class panel of experts. Joining us this evening, firstly, Dayan Menachem Geli Schlitzer, Rosh Beis Din of the London Beis Din. Born in Newcastle, Dayan Geli studied at Sunderland Yeshiva and then Ponevezh Yeshiva in Bnei Brak before moving to the Gateshead Kollel. Dayan Geli trained as a Dayan at Batei Din in the United States and Israel and joined the London Beis Din in 1993. He has lectured extensively on Jewish law, is an external examiner for Birkbeck College, London, and is Rabbi of Or Chodesh Shul in Golders Green. Professor Anthony Warrens is Dean for Education and Director of the Institute of Health Sciences Education at Barts, the London School of Medicine and Dentistry. He's also a Professor of Renal Transplantation Medicine at Queen Mary's University of London. He's a practicing consultant renal physician with a particular interest in transplantation medicine. Professor Warrens is a former president of the British Transplantation Society and has sat on several governmental bodies developing UK policy and advice on matters relating to transplantation. Dr. Richard Shub is a consultant in intensive care medicine and anaesthetist at Barnet Hospital, Royal Free London. He's been clinical lead for organ donation at the Trust for 10 years and has lectured extensively on this topic to both medical and lay audiences. He's also a member of Borehamwood Elstree Synagogue. Mr. Ari Jesner is the Chief Executive of the Office of the Chief Rabbi. He grew up in Glasgow, Jerusalem, and London, read law at the University of Westminster, and received his M.Phil in theology from the University of Cambridge. Ari is a qualified solicitor and previously worked at city law firm Berwin Leighton Paisner, where he advised clients on complex strategic arrangements for the provision of critical services and infrastructure across a number of sectors. We're also fortunate to have Dr. Mark Wittenberg, transplant anaesthetist at the Royal Free and medical director of the Jewish Organ Donor Association, who will be answering medical questions in the chat on Facebook and YouTube. Dr. Shub, if I can come to you first, and you'll address for us, please, the end-of-life diagnosis and the donation process. Dr. Shub.
Right, thank you very much for the introduction. As you say, I'm a member of Borehamwood United Shul and wear a couple of professional hats. I'm intensive care consultant at Barnet Hospital and clinical lead for organ donation at the Royal Free London. And really, it's that latter role that I'm speaking to you in this evening. And really, my talk, I want to focus on two things. Number one, I want to reiterate the importance of organ donation. And secondly, I want to shed a little bit of light on the end-of-life care in intensive care, the diagnosis of death, and the impact these have on organ donation. So to start off with the importance of organ donation, 3 people a day in this country die waiting for a transplant. Organ donation is not only a modern medical miracle, but it is possibly the only positive thing that comes out of a personal tragedy. The ability for one person at the end of their life to save multiple other lives is an act of unparalleled generosity. I think it's also worth just thinking and realizing just how rare donation actually is. So in this country of, say, 65 million people, around about 1% will die each year, 600,000. Now, for any one of those to be a potential organ donor, they would need to die in hospital, not only in hospital, but in intensive care, not only in intensive care, but indeed on life support. And even then, a large number would be ineligible for a whole range of medical reasons. So we can see that organ donation is an exquisitely rare and precious thing. So what is organ donation? What do we mean? Well, there are actually two categories of organ donation. There is living donation and there is deceased donation. In living donation, a person, while they are alive, donates an organ to somebody else, usually a relative. Now, although this is unquestionably an important form of donation, the reality is that the only organs that can be donated through this way of donation are kidneys, and to a much smaller degree, livers, or at least the lobes of livers. And therefore, living donation actually makes up a small percentage of the overall donation and transplantation in the country. In addition, the consent for living donation comes from the donor themselves. And because it's not really affected by the consent and opt-in, opt-out that we're discussing this evening, I'm not going to comment any further on it. The second type of donation is deceased donation. In other words, donation after a person has died. And these make up the majority of donations and include donations of heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, small bowel and pancreas, as well as tissue donations such as skin and bones, heart valves, corneas, etc. Deceased donation occurs after death, and therefore defining death and diagnosing death are absolutely crucial to this form of donation. Clearly, someone has to be dead before they can donate. And this is known as the dead donor rule. It is inviolable, and the crux of it is the diagnosis of death. And that's really what I want to talk about next. Now, you might have thought that diagnosing death would be a pretty straightforward part of medicine, but you'd be wrong. In actual fact, it's fairly complex. And the reason is because it's not, although we think of death as a moment in time, physiologically it isn't. It's a process. Indeed, at a cellular level, the cells, there's lots of life still going on long after the brain and the heart and the lungs cease to function. But for the purposes of legal point of view and societal needs and organ donation needs, we do need to define a specific point in this process, and that's the point of irreversibility. And in medicine, it's the irreversibility of the ability to breathe and the irreversibility of loss of consciousness. When those two things are present, then the patient is deemed to have died. So you can see from that in medicine, the anatomical seat of death, the site of death, is the brain. When the brain dies, and specifically the brain stem dies, we diagnose that the patient is dead. Now, this can be done of one of two ways. Either we can examine the heart, and if there's been no heartbeat for at least 5 minutes, then we can confidently state that the brain stem is dead, has died, and the person is dead. And we call this diagnosing death on circulatory criteria. Alternatively, we can examine the function of the brainstem itself directly through a series of clinical examinations. And when these are performed and there appears to be no function in the brainstem, then again, we diagnose that the patient is dead. And this time, the diagnosis is death, brainstem death, or death on neurological criteria. So again, just to stress, it is the brain that counts in medicine when diagnosing death. It is perfectly possible for a patient to be on a heart-lung machine with blood pumped around their body, and they can be awake and talking to you and very much alive, but with no heartbeat at all. So it is the brain, and particularly the brain stem, that is the crux of diagnosis of death in medicine. There are a couple of other points I would like to stress. Both methods of diagnosing death, both on neurological criteria and on circulatory criteria, are equally valid in terms of diagnosing death. The second point is that we as doctors are expected to diagnose death whether or not the patient is going to go on to donate. It is a professional and indeed a legal requirement of doctors that if they suspect death, that they examine for it and declare death if it is present. the final point I would want to stress is that what I describe in the diagnosis of death is accepted universally in modern medicine and in scientific circles as the gold standard in diagnosing death. Indeed, there are some countries which have ancillary additional tests in the form of scans and what have you, but those are inferior and they only ever are added to the gold standard, which is what I've described and which has been present in as to how we diagnose death for well over 50 years now. I finally want to touch on the donation process itself. How does one actually get into the process of donation? Well, firstly, families may be approached in one of two ways. The first one might be that the relative has suffered a catastrophic brain injury. It might be a stroke, it might be a bleed on the brain, it might be a traumatic injury. And it is so severe that it has led to the brainstem dying. And the doctors examine the brainstem reflexes and establish that the patient is brainstem dead, and therefore dead. And they approach the family, and if the family agree to donation, then donation would proceed, and we would call that donation after brainstem death. The second scenario that a family might be faced with is that their loved one is on the intensive care, on life support, and the doctors looking after them feel that it is hopeless, ongoing treatment is futile, it's not going to change the outcome. So in collaboration with the family, the decision is made to withdraw life-sustaining treatment. This is done, the patient, their heart stops, and they are declared dead on circulatory criteria. Should the family agree to donation, then this would proceed, and we would call this donation after circulatory death. Again, I would want to stress at this point that it's really important to understand that the performance of brainstem death tests or the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment would go ahead whether or not the patient is going to donate organs. They are independent. Diagnosis of death is a prerequisite for donation of organs, but there are indeed two separate things, two separate entities. From there, if the family has agreed to donation, what happens then? So the family agrees to donate. The next step is that a series of blood tests and x-rays and scans would be performed, and the patient, the recipients across the country would then be contacted, and they would go into the various hospitals across the country in anticipation of their organ transplants. And the final step would be that the patient goes to theatre for their organ donation. So I hope that over the past few minutes I've managed to shed some light on what lies behind organ donation. The gift of life to one person is rare. The gift of life to multiple people is even rarer. We really need to reach out and grab it whenever we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shub, for that very clear definition of death from a clinical point of view, and also explain to us about the donation process. That leads us on to Diane Gelly. Diane Gelly, if you could please address us in terms of the halacha, in terms of the implications of definition of death and organ donation.
Good evening, Rabbi Chapa, eminent colleagues this evening. So we're going to try and make a bit of a précis on this, because obviously the issue involves quite complex halachic minutiae and detail. But we'll begin with the question of the opt-in, opt-out, which has somehow thrown people. So I'd just like to quickly dispel the confusion. People are saying, well, opt-in, opt-out, have I got to do something? What should I do? Which way should I do it? So really, if a person would want to opt out, because that's his view, whether philosophically or for whatever reason, it's a choice of every person, notwithstanding the presentation we've just heard. If he does want to opt out, then he can opt out. He could opt out now. If he's got a question, if he doesn't opt out, is he guaranteed at a later stage that were the family to be conveying his views, whether that would be accepted? We've been told by government at the moment that certainly doctors would take into consideration a view of family, but legally they have no locus standi to determine, and it's the deceased in their lifetime who ought to express a view of whether they want to donate or not. So therefore the question really is, in Jewish law, if a person does want to be generous, the great gift of life, and be a donor, are they allowed to do so? Is it correct to do so? Is it a mitzvah to do so? Is it an obligation to do so? And under what terms? So let me begin by telling you one of the sayings in the Talmud, Kol HaMekayim Nefesh Achas. Anyone who is able to give existence to a single life, it's as if he's established a whole world. Because we know creation was made for Adam Harishon, for the first person. Every person is unique, and the world is worthwhile for even just one person. So therefore, it's obviously from the outset, we convey the Jewish view that wherever we can assist with life, give life, then that has got to be the greatest deed of all. Let me then go to a question of when, friends, do you believe the earliest question of organ donation came about? To my knowledge, the first organ donor operation was performed in 1954 or so. But the truth is, a few hundred years ago already, the Rabbi David Zimra, 15th century scholar, posed the following question, was asked the following question. In those days, there was a ruler who had amongst his subjects a Jewish person who was condemned to death. And in the way they worked in those days, he told another member of the Jewish community, if you're to allow me to remove an organ, cut off your hand, your arm, your leg, whatever it is, obviously without you dying, and give that instead, then I will spare the life of this other person. And the question posed was, is it obligatory on the person who had the offer to give their limb, to give that limb in order to spare the other Jewish person his life? Pikuach nefesh, saving life is paramount. How far does that go? And part of that discussion revolved around as to whether the person whose, God forbid, limb would be severed would put himself into danger. If that's the case, then the rabbi ruled that there's no question, even if it's only a safek, even if it's only a far-fetched situation, and he's not allowed to do it. And even if the case will be that there's no question, it was taking a tip of a finger, which would not involve any danger of life ostensibly, nonetheless, there's no obligation to do it. If he wanted to do it, it would be something beyond, and it would be a big mitzvah, but he's got no obligation to do it. And that led current decisors to pose the question in terms of live donation, and Dr. Shub elaborated a little bit on that, but I would like to mention it and also inform you that both in Israel and in America, amongst the Jewish community in Israel, it's called Matnat Chaim, the gift of life. In America, it's called Renewal, or two Jewish organizations who have organized for thousands of people, literally, who are waiting for donation to receive that by matching them with a live donor. Now that is tremendous, and it's a tremendous mitzvah. Mitzvah can mean a good deed, mitzvah can mean an obligation. We've already determined it cannot be an obligation, but that is tremendous good deed, and you should be aware that that exists. But as we mentioned earlier, primarily that is not what actually happens at this stage in this country. And certainly the question today is, opt-in or opt-out means, can one join the organ donor registry in order to basically opt in and say, oh, the absence of opting out is really opting in. Basically, can one currently give an organ, donate an organ under the current system? So let's discuss briefly what the issues may be. We're now talking about a cadaver, a deceased person, who during their lifetime, they're giving instructions that when they're not alive anymore, their organ should be donated. So truth is, obviously, the end result is desirous. There's no question about that. And the mitzvah element, that's amazing and fantastic. On the other hand, there are certain prohibitions in Jewish law which we would have to overcome in order to allow it. So just let me mention three. Number one, you'll all be aware of the issue of post-mortems, that in this country, if situations, somebody dies and it's unknown and the coroner wants a post-mortem, thank God, through good Jews within the community and some of our Gentile friends, we've succeeded in minimizing post-mortems and having MRI scans instead, wherever they're able to give the result one is looking for. Why is that? And why is so much effort expended into an MRI whereby the body would not actually be cut into rather than just allowing a post-mortem? Surely the post-mortem is helpful for criminal reasons, helpful to find out, God forbid, none of the other family should be affected for a host of reasons. There's a reason why a post-mortem is done. So why is that an issue for Jewish people? The answer is because there is a prohibition of what's called nivul hamet, of desecrating a body. And anyone who knows about Chevra Kadisha work know how carefully a Jewish body is dealt with, is cared for, is held, is laid, and etc. The very thought that one goes in and cuts, even though it's obviously done in a professional way and nothing unnecessary is done, but the very fact one cuts in is and removes an organ is called nivul hametz. That is one problem we'd have to contend with. There's another problem we have to contend with, that according to Jewish law, a person after he's died is asur b'hana'ah. There are many things in Jewish law, some things you can't eat, some things you can't smell. Some things become forbidden to derive any benefit from. One of those, don't want to use the word object, one of those items is a deceased person. One's not allowed to use a body for whatever reason one would want to use it for. Surely, taking a body part and using it, albeit to save another life, is a problem of Isur Hana'ah. Third problem is that there is an obligation of burial. Now, obviously, the one's going to bury the body in the main. However, the halacha is one has got to bury the whole body. Some of you may be aware, God forbid, there's been accidents or there's been terrorist attacks, and there have been people who have Chevra Kadisha who have taken blood from the site and actually buried that with blood that oozes after a person struck, also needs to be buried. So the notion that part of a person that ought to be buried is ultimately not buried is also problematic. Those are three issues. Rabbi Unterman, he was actually a chief rabbi, chief rabbi was senior rabbi in Liverpool for 20 years or so, and then he became the chief rabbi of Israel. He wrote one of the first responsa on this, going back to the 50s, where he debated these points, and at the end of the day came to the conclusion, I wouldn't say there was unanimous agreement, but over the years, everybody agrees in principle, that the notion that one can save a life actually takes precedence and reigns supreme over or prevails over these prohibitions. There are other reasons why to allow it. So others have argued that the notion one's got to bury, that's only something that's dead. And the notion that if you give this another lease of life, you've rather done a tchiyat hamesim, you've done some type of resurrection of this part of dead body by living in another person. So therefore, what do you mean you've got to bury it? But it's living. There were other reasons. Others said that it's pikuach nefesh, for example, giving a cornea to somebody else was always the problem, because he's not going to die without. And others said, yes, if it's a blind person and he could trip, or God forbid it could be fatal. That's always the question: how far do you take the concern of life and death? Till what degree is, not everything is a worry of life and death. That also goes into the equation and beyond the scope of what I'm able to discuss here tonight. But bottom line, just to say, well, organation, nothing wrong. Of course it's allowed. It's not an of course, but Jewish law has decided, the decisors have decided, that in order to save a life, we're going to overcome all the various prohibitions we've discussed. The only hurdles that remain for donation, these now are relevant to Dr. Shub's earlier discussion in determining death, because in Jewish law, and that's a big subject of its own, there is a big issue as to what is what's called Zman HaMavet. What determines death? Is it brain death? Is it brain stem death? Is it cardiopulmonary? Is it heartbeat? Is it all of those, and etc.? And that is a complex point. Israel, the rabbinate in Israel, took a decision in this already many years back, but with certain provisos and under certain conditions, which we have a letter from Israel where they've told us that they don't believe it's relevant to us, God forbid, not questioning the competence or the integrity of our doctors, but doesn't necessarily apply over here in this country. Israel also specifically did not allow this criteria for organ donation. They applied this criteria only when a decision came where the person should be removed from a machine to allow the machine to be used for somebody else, rather when it's a question of triage or not. Now, the big question is, okay, so let's say, well, as the doctors told us, senior doctors in an NHS, okay, so if we can't get brain death patients, which are the majority, we'll be happy at least whatever extra organ we can have. The problem is that even if we're going to go for cardiorespiratory death, what's a big question, let me just leave it at that in Halacha, is if a person is actually living, let's say he's not even brain dead, but his quality of life is such that he's going to have no quality whatsoever, whereby doctors and family will determine it's futile, but he is breathing, albeit with the support of machinery, then to go and remove him from that is also a question of removing life from a person. I don't like using the severe word murdering or killing, but it is a serious question of removing the life of one person, albeit it's in order to save the life of somebody else. We cannot play God. We're not entitled to. We have to determine things technically on the basis of Jewish law. What's certainly allowed is if a person were naturally to die, which obviously for hospitals is an untenable situation. They can't be there 3:23 a.m. when a person dies with a whole team and ready to retrieve it and then ready to transplant it. The system doesn't work. But hypothetically, theoretically, that would be perfectly permissible in Jewish law. Once a person has died, as long as there's no arterial or intervention whilst they're alive in order to retrieve the organs after not alive anymore, because that's another issue, touching or tampering with a dying person, which is strictly forbidden in Jewish law. But if a person were to naturally die, and then after the death, a short period is waited just to confirm he is indeed dead, and then the organs were retrieved, then it would be a mitzvah and a great deed of kindness in order to allow those organs to be retrieved and to give them on to other people that they should have life. That will allow kidneys, that will allow other organs, it will restrict. So at this point of time, what's certainly not allowed is a heart transplant, because obviously that would mean removing the heart of a living person, because if he isn't living, then you can't take it, and that will be a serious problem in Jewish law. We are told that with the exciting development of medicine and technology, then it may be possible to keep a heart alive even post the death of a person in order to be able to give it to somebody else. And then again, that will be perfectly permissible as long as the other factors were left untouched. One would actually be able to use that organ, and once one can use it, then obviously it is, as mentioned, a mitzvah to be able to go and use it. So in a nutshell, that is the halachic situation, and obviously any detail I say at the Beth would always be pleased to share with any members of the community at any time. Thank you.
Thank you, Eli, for providing us with that absolute clarity on the halacha, and we're tremendously privileged that you were able to share with us the Jewish view on this matter and your expertise in this area as well. Thank you again, Diane Gelly. Delighted to now ask Professor Anthony Warrens to share with us his view and ideas in relation to consent, with regard to opt-out and transplantation. Professor Warrens.
Thank you very much indeed for having me this evening, and I'm very pleased to be in the company of such an august group of individuals. I'd like to take a few minutes just to talk about this issue of consent and opt-out. And Dr. Shub has very nicely led into my comments when he talked about the value of and the need for transplantation. Everybody will be aware that if your heart or your lungs or your liver fails, that is incompatible with life. Certainly, if your kidneys fail, you can undergo dialysis, which will keep you alive, but the life expectancy of a transplant recipient, a kidney transplant recipient, is approximately double the life expectancy of a dialysis patient. And so that too is life extending, as well as improving the quality of life. And as Dr. Shub said, a well-known statistic, but bears repetition, that there is an enormous need for transplantation, because, as he said, 3 people a day die in this country on the waiting list, die needlessly in the sense that if an organ became available for them, they could join the ranks of individuals whose lives were significantly extended by virtue of transplantation. So there's a need and there's an opportunity here. And who would, in many respects, one ask the question, who would say anything other than this is something I absolutely wish to do? These are organs for which you have no use after your death. And therefore it is no cost to you at all to give your organs on to people who are desperately in need of them. A paper that is well established and probably underestimates the value of transplantation tells us that if one individual donates all organs that are possible and you aggregate the additional benefit, it results in 56 extra years of life for the recipients. What a fantastic opportunity to make a major contribution to the lives of 6 or 7 other people, and of course to their families. Indeed, transplantation will restore fertility, and we now have many of our transplant recipients who have had children, which would not have been possible if they had not been transplanted. So the number of extra years of life actually is greatly in excess of the 56 that I've just described, but that in itself is an absolutely phenomenal statistic. So one would ask the question, surely everybody would wish to, given the opportunity, make this fantastic contribution of their organs after their own death at a time when they have no value to them. And the answer is, all statistics, all surveys that have been done suggest that is exactly the case. The vast majority of people would like to be donors given the opportunity. So where is the disconnect? Why is it that, unfortunately, many people who could be donors do not become donors? Now, Dr. Shub is absolutely right. The number of people who die who could become donors is actually very small. But of those who could, there is a very disappointing number of individuals who do not. Disappointing because, as I've already said, the evidence really suggests that they wished to become donors. So how do we get around this? How do we deal with this? How do we allow individuals to pursue this phenomenal act of altruism that undoubtedly is something that many people would have liked to do? Well, in the ideal world, an individual would have thought about this in the cold light of day, would have taken advice from their rabbanim and their other advisors and discussed with their family what they would like them to do in the circumstances that somebody becomes a potential donor, when, of course, they themselves are unlikely at that point to be able to say what their intentions and their desires are. Because it's a very, very emotionally charged time when somebody is nearing the end of their life or has reached the end of their life, then to ask the families, who are, of course, distraught at the loss of this loved one, to ask them if they would be prepared to permit donation. Much better that one discusses this in advance in the cold light of day to make sure that individuals know, their family know what their views are. One wants to avoid the awful situation that I've come across where a family has said, no, under no circumstances do we wish to be donors. Therefore, of course, the donation didn't happen. And the following day, the family sent somebody back and said, we've thought about it. This is something they would have wished, and we could make some good come out of this awful situation. But by then, of course, it's too late. So we need to deal with the situation in the very emotionally tense time. And this has led us to the idea of opt-out, the idea of giving legal standing to the evidence that the vast majority of people would actually like to help those other potential recipients if the circumstances were right. Everybody then has the opportunity to say, actually, for whatever reason, this is not something I wish to do, and they can opt out. But if they haven't taken that option that was open to them, then the move towards a deemed consent or opt-out process means that there will be more people who would potentially become donors. And there is evidence that this works. There's evidence from other countries, such as Spain, Austria, part of the Benelux countries. But actually, we're now beginning to get evidence from our own country. In 2015, Wales passed an opt-out act. And over the course of the past year or so, it's become clear that that has resulted in a statistically significant increase in donation. It took a few years to get there because actually there are relatively few people in Wales who become donors. The population is very small, and so it took some time to reach statistical significance, but it has now. And so this is something that works. This is something that will help individuals reach the aspiration that we know the vast majority would have, but it also has within it built-in safeguards to make sure that individuals who do not wish to do that are able to give voice to that. And as I know Ari will talk about later, there's particular safeguards for people who wish to make sure that their own religious views are taken account of. But it goes further than this. You will hear people talking about the soft opt-out and the hard opt-out. And the hard opt-out essentially says the law is the law. The individual has the right to make a decision. We have deemed that that decision has to be expressed actively, and that the assumption will be, if they don't make that statement on the organ donor register, then that means they wished to be donors, and we will, at the time of death, proceed whatever anyone else says, including the family. That is absolutely not what the implications of this bill are. This is a soft opt-out, and it is a situation in which we will, of course, always listen to, seek out, and pursue the interest, the opinions of the family. If there is no active statement by this individual on the organ donor register, then the people closest to them will be approached and asked, do they know what this person's views were? And their opinions will be taken account of. If they say, well, actually, I know he never wrote it down, but he didn't really hold by this and wouldn't wish to have been a donor, that will be respected. And it is impossible to imagine that a team of surgeons would take an individual to theatre to remove their organs in the face of implacable opposition from a family who were saying this is not what he wanted. And so there are many, many safeguards to protect the individual. That individual himself or herself can make sure that their views are expressed in the organ donor register, which is extremely easy to sign up to. They can make sure that provision is taken account of for their own religious beliefs. And the family, of course, will be consulted at the time in order to ensure that we gain maximum information about what that individual's rights, views were. So given that it works, given that there is a massive deficit in the number of organs that are needed, and this results in a huge amount of pain and suffering from people who could otherwise be helped, and given that we have data that suggests that this is very much what the majority of people in this country would like to do, the view was taken, and I agree with it, that there are very, very few risks for this and very many benefits, and that people are protected. And when ultimately one is talking about the potential for an individual donating way in excess of 56 years of extra life to other human beings, it would be unconscionable for us not to take serious account of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Warrens. Thank you so much for that very compelling explanation of the subject. Now we move on to our final speaker for the evening. The Chief Rabbi's Office has been working very closely with the London-based in and with the NHSBT. And to tell us about that work, we have the Chief Executive of the Chief Rabbi's Office, Ari Jesner. Ari, if you'd like to speak, tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Chapper. I'm delighted to be here and to share the platform, so to speak, with such an august group of panelists. So thank you very much for having me. So I come to this from a different sort of angle to the other speakers. I'm not a halachic expert like Dayan Geli, and I'm not a medical expert like Professor Warrens or Dr. Shub. Firstly, I'm a member of a Jewish community with an interest in this area, as many people in the community have, and like you will be this evening, which is why you've tuned in. I also have my own family story as brother of Yoni Jesner, as some of you may know. My youngest brother, Yoni, was killed by a suicide bombing on a bus in Tel Aviv in 2002. And we as a family went through the donor process when, because of the way he was killed, he had a bolt that went through his brainstem, and he was a perfect candidate to be an organ donor. He was in perfect health and died from what they call severe trauma to the brain, which left the rest of him in perfect condition. And although we never discussed as a family the issue of organ donation before, nor had we discussed it with Yoni, something that Professor Warrens spoke about a bit earlier, whilst initially shocked by the prospect, having never discussed it before, we instinctively knew what the right thing to do was going to be for Yoni. Yoni was to return to London to study medicine. And if in his life he would now be unable to save lives and help other people, then at least in his death, he would be able to do so. So Yoni's organs went to 5 different people, including a young Palestinian girl. And that's what turned his death into an international story at the time. But fast forward from 2002 to 2017-18, and I'm working with the Chief Rabbi. I'm in the Chief Rabbi's office, and the only thing that it would seem that Theresa May, the then Prime Minister, and Jeremy Corbyn, the then Leader of the Opposition, were able to agree on was that there was a need to change the organ donation system from an opt-in to an opt-out or a deemed consent system. And what I want to share with you this evening is a particular journey that we've been on in the Office of the Chief Rabbi, working with the various parts of the National Health Service in order to bring about a wonderful development where members of the Jewish community can sign up to be organ donors. And I think it's fair to say that as a community, the proposal to change the law did come as quite of an unwelcome surprise. Not that we're against organ donation, as you've heard from the other speakers this evening, but more because the uncomfortable connotations that come with a change in the system, the idea of taking organs, of our bodies not being our own, and what of halakha? Many assume that halakha prohibits donating organs, and we've heard from Dayan Geli this evening that that is not the case. So the draft legislation was very brief and contained very little detail. and the Board of Deputies sought assurances from the Ministry of Health at the time. And whilst these were helpful and we played a role in trying to bolster and strengthen these, by their very nature, they were always going to be quite general. So it's worth just taking a moment to point out the key players involved here who we had to work with were NHS Blood and Transplant, that's NHSBT, who are responsible for the implementation of the legislation, and the Human Tissue Authority, the HTA, who have responsibility for the codes of practice that guides practitioners in this area, and in particular working with the specialist nurses for organ donation, known as SNODs, who engage with families and the range of parties involved in donation. And I think it's probably fair to say that at the outset, NHSBT were a little concerned about implementing the new system and what that might involve. And the medical profession, as you'd expect, had different views about which system was preferable. And you heard Professor Warrens talk about this just before. What was clear, though, was that NHSBT had a lot of stakeholder engagement to do if they were able to sell the new system to the public and get buy-in, particularly from some pockets of society and faith communities in particular, who may be a little bit more skeptical. At the Office of the Chief Rabbi firmly saw this as an opportunity. There had been no shortage of attempts to engage with the NHS on organ donation issues by the community over previous years, but it was always too challenging to get them to adapt their systems for our community, and perhaps understandably so. We're a small community, and the NHS system and network is a real behemoth. When we met with NHS Blood and Transplant a couple of years ago now, we made clear to them that we deeply wished to work with them and to ensure that the new deemed consent organ donation system could work for the Jewish community in order to enable us right across the community, from left to right, to sign up as organ donors. We made it clear that we thought this would be challenging, even if the system was not changing and was remaining as an opt-in system, and how much more so now with the new system. They were relieved that we hadn't just told them that it wasn't going to be possible and walked away, and we resolved to work together to see if we could make this work. And we agreed that if at any point it became too difficult, we would seek to resolve the issues, and it might just be that we need to shake hands and walk away, having tried our best. But thankfully, that didn't happen. And what became clear when we met with the senior representatives of NHSBT, and they explained how the system operated in practice, and some of this you've heard from the medical professionals this evening, was it was much more, I suppose, from a layman's perspective, I'd say user-friendly or sensitive or accommodating than many of us and many in the community might have thought. So the NHSBT in particular, go to extensive lengths over long periods of time to identify family members before pursuing any kind of donation. And there are many stages and teams involved in the donation process, so nullifying any possibility of a rogue member of staff or someone taking organs in some kind of malign fashion. Organs will not be taken where there is no full medical history if it can't be reliably ascertained, and this requires a conversation with next of kin. It always does. And a conversation with family is determinative. So when family members reject donation, even if the individual expressed a wish to be a donor in their lifetime, like you heard from Professor Warrens, the donation will not go ahead. They would expect families to substantiate their view, whether on religious grounds or because they knew the wishes of the donor. But NHSBT takes the approach that they do not want to add to the considerable distress experienced by families, and this behaviour would go against medical ethics. The system itself, as operated in practice, but is probably little known amongst the general public, in itself therefore heavily mitigates against a major source of concern, namely that a move to deemed consent system could result in loss of autonomy over our bodies or our organs being taken. Donations don't take place when the family cannot be found or when donations would be against the family's wishes. And our understanding following the meeting was that the reality of how organ donation works in practice is inadequately reflected in how the move to deemed consent was being explained or presented and understood widely out there. The key finding is that although the legislation creates an opt-out system, the only change in reality is the basis on which the specialist nurses commence conversations with the family in a donation scenario. Under the new system, the conversation will now start with an explanation of the fact that the system of organ donation in the country has an automatic presumption in favour of donation, but will then, as it does now, go on to ask whether they have any information they want to share about the donor's beliefs or wishes, and presumption in favor of donation does not in and of itself mean that donation will happen. What we then did was say to NHS Blood and Transplant and the Human Tissue Authority is that if this is in fact the case in practice and it's already happening, how can we bake all these points into the system itself of the organ donation system and register to give us and the community the necessary comfort to be able to tell the community that they can go online and they can sign up to be organ donors. So the NHS BT senior team came in to meet with Diane Gelly and his colleagues at the London Beit Din and the Office of the Chief Rabbi. So me and my colleagues had numerous meetings with them where we eventually got to the system which we now have and which I believe is actually live already in terms of ability to sign up. And the way it works is that when you go online to sign up as a donor, you tick a specific box that says you want to be a faith donor. I would like NHS, this is what it says, I would like NHS staff to speak to my family and anyone else appropriate about how organ donation can go ahead in line with my faith and beliefs. And you say that this is applicable to you. And the NHS there on the website, NHSBT, have a statement which they have committed to, which we have agreed with them. And the wording has been approved and agreed. That is basically their commitment to our faith and beliefs, which means that anybody who signs up to be an organ donor, who ticks the box to say that their faith and belief is important to them, and then later identify as being Jewish, will in fact ensure that the family are consulted and have the opportunity to consult with a rabbi or their halachic authority or the Beit Din to ensure that in their specific circumstances of their case, the appropriate advice and input can be given to make a decision in that individual case as to whether donation can go ahead. And I'm not going to read the whole statement, it runs to about a page, but I recommend you go on the website and look at it. I'm just going to read you one line from it, which says, should your family and religious authorities be assured that your organs or tissue can be donated in a manner compliant with your faith, beliefs, and practices, then donation can proceed. And that effectively sums it all up. If the family and the religious authority there at the time involved in the case determined that for whatever reason, in the particular circumstances of your death, that donation cannot proceed, then donation will not proceed. And when you click through, having registered, there is also a statement that you can see, which is the donor's statement confirming the terms and conditions, if you like, the basis upon which we as donors are donating. And that is something that you can share with family and friends and ensure that people know the basis upon which you are donating, and that will be adhered to. It's worth just mentioning that the Human Tissue Authority, who deal with the codes of practice, ensure that the specialist nurses get the right training so that when they see that a donor has indicated that faith is important to them, they understand the faith sensitivities and understand the faith statement. And we're introducing a helpline so that if families are unsure, or even if the specialist nurses are unsure, they can call the helpline, which will take them through to the London Beit Din. And thank you, Diane Gelly, for agreeing to be on standby. And appropriate halachic input and advice can be sought at that time if families don't have their own rabbi or rabbinic authority that they wish to go to. So what we've achieved here is effectively a type of conditional donation as part of the new deemed consent system, where if you register as a faith donor, your family together with your rabbi will be consulted and the right decision about donation will be made for you in the specific circumstances of your case. So I encourage you all to go on and register now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari, for sharing with us both your personal and professional experience. It's really enlightening to hear how much, a tremendous amount of work has been done behind the scenes on this very issue. Now, our panel has very graciously agreed to take some questions, and I'd like to invite Dr. Mark Wittenberg to pose those questions to our panel.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you, all of you, for a fantastic set of presentations where I think we've covered a huge amount of ground. And I hope the audience will be will be left with a significant amount of information in order to be able to make their own minds up about organ donation. But I just wanted to pick up on a few of the points, if I may, and if I could turn to you first of all, Diane Gelly. Towards the end of your presentation, you addressed the matter of a particular heart donation, and I wonder if you could address a scenario where there is a potential recipient of a heart, for example, who's Jewish, and they're about to, well, they're offered a heart which may not have been retrieved or donated in a strict halachic fashion, so it's maybe not from the Jewish community. What would be the approach then?
Well, that's a very good question. So this is debated in halakha, and there are no grounds to forbid this. There is a concept in Jewish law generally that sometimes, for example, on Shabbat, where someone was not inadvertent and they did something wrong on Shabbat, they're told not to benefit from that. So the idea does exist. In this case, the Jewish patient recipient was not one who instructed the removal of the heart from another person, because I understand in all systems there are walls between the departments of the donors and the recipients. In that case, if the heart is there, notwithstanding it may have been retrieved in a way which was not in accordance with halakha, it doesn't become forbidden, and therefore the patient is absolutely entitled to receive that and have a new lease of life. That's absolutely in order and perfectly okay. In particular, a heart is sort of a situation where invariably, where we're up to today, my understanding will have been taken when that person was alive. But even a situation where it was questionable, so the fact it was in a grey area, we certainly would not forbid it later on to be given to another person. So another organ retrieved at that time could go to another Jewish person, all the more so. Yeah.
Thank you. And if I could turn to you, Dr. Shu, Richard, we've worked together, and I've been party to these very difficult scenarios, and been party to the diagnosis and to the diagnosis of death as you've described it in the intensive care unit, and I must say it's a very protracted and well described process. But I wondered if you could just address the particular matter of how you might start talking to a family who's in that situation, a devastating situation, who may not have thought about this, may not have given it, may not even have talked to their loved one about it. How do you possibly go about broaching that discussion and coming to a decision with them?
Well, thank you, Mark. Yes, as you know, there's no real way around that. This is an extremely difficult conversation. It always is. You are dealing with a distraught family. Not infrequently, their relative has been previously fit and healthy, and then all of a sudden this absolutely devastating news is thrust upon them. And then you bombard them with information coming to them from every side. And then on top of all of that, you are putting before them an extremely difficult question. You're expecting them to make a decision about organ donation, a question about life and death in such a difficult situation. And there's no real way around that it is a very difficult conversation, clearly for the family, but it's equally difficult for the staff as well. I guess I should pay tribute at this point to the specialist nurses, the SNODs, who are fantastically understanding and experienced in the communication at this time, and really are a great source of help to those of us in intensive care when we do approach families. I think one of the crucial bits for me, and this is what I teach my trainees when I'm talking to them about it, is you can't move on to the question of donation until you have dealt with the question of death. The family have to accept that their loved one either has already passed away or is going to pass away before you can even think about organ donation. If you don't do that, then donation, understandably, is something that all families would think, because they haven't internalized that understanding that their loved one has already gone. And so really it has to be broken down into stage one, which is acceptance of the reality that they have lost someone close to them. And that itself takes time, and it's my personal practice that I even break that down into several shorter conversations, because it's too much for a family to take in just one go. And only when that has been internalized and accepted and the reality has been able to set in, do I even consider or think about approaching organ donation. And then again, it's about time, it's about trust, it's about repetition. Families are distraught, very rarely remember what you say to them the first time. There's just so much going on in their mind. And those are some of the techniques that we use to try and have this very difficult conversation.
Thank you. If I may turn to you, Professor Warrens, you very nicely elucidated some of the barriers to donation and to transplant. And indeed, when Joda and we conducted our survey of the Jewish community looking at attitudes towards organ donation, one of those barriers which you alluded to was the fact that people are very reluctant to talk about organ donation and their wishes with their families and their loved ones kind of in the cold light of day. I wonder if I could ask you how you might suggest anyone starts that conversation and uses that in order to make their own mind up about how they would move forward in terms of the organ donation question.
So choosing your moment is crucial, and there are many occasions when it would absolutely be the wrong thing to talk about. But increasingly, individuals are becoming aware that there are some very hard decisions to be taken at the end of life. And increasingly, they're saying they are less sure that they would like a doctor to use a technical term, to strive officiously to keep them alive, to subject them to investigation after intervention, after experimental therapy, with no real expectation of a positive outcome. People know that this is a real issue, and increasingly people are saying, this is how I would like to go, and this is how I would like the end of my life to be managed. And in the context of that conversation, is a natural part of that, and indeed a rather more positive gloss on it, to say, but you know what? There's something positive that can come out of a very difficult and unpleasant situation. And if I can offer the opportunity to other people to extend their lives by being an organ donor after my death, then that's something I would like to do. So as more and more of those conversations are being had, and they are, that fits in very nicely with that. And I would encourage people to do it. Of course, some people find it a very hard thing to do. Some people find it extremely difficult to consider the possibility of their own death. But increasingly, I think there is an openness in communication between the generations that really didn't exist previously. And part of that, I think, will involve people being open about these extremely difficult subjects. It depends on the nature of your relationship. Certainly, these are conversations that might be more naturally had with one's partner than with one's children. But nonetheless, the relationship with children is becoming a much more open and communicative one. And so I hope that this is something that will be had in discussions. And it's something that, you know, we're talking about in the public domain that people would previously have shied away from. And so if, as it were, permission is given to have those conversations in the public arena, then I think it's more likely to happen. There will be situations when it does not happen, but I think we will see more and more of it over the years.
Thank you. Yeah, and that was certainly one of the motivations behind holding the event tonight. Is hopefully driving those discussions. And finally, Ari, I must just offer my congratulations for this fantastic achievement. I mean, you elucidated the journey you've been on wonderfully, and the relationship that you've struck with NHSBT and partners around the community. So really, to you and your team, Mazel Tov. Some of the questions that we've been getting about this is people are concerned that they have to act now, and if they don't tick box now, then it's too late. I wonder if you could just give a little bit more detail about what you suggest members of the community do at this stage, if anything.
Sure. Thank you for asking that question, because it's a really important point, which has been complicated by the whole COVID pandemic, which has actually delayed things for the government and for NHS. So whilst on the one hand, this particular law came into effect on the 20th of May, we have this kind of odd situation where there is a law in the statute books, but no one is actually abiding by it or implementing it for the time being, until NHSBT have the capacity and the bandwidth to get the systems up and running, carry out the proper training, etc. Now, we had been led to believe that this would be a number of months, but it would seem, in the way that the NHS have managed to work miracles over the last few months, they've done another one, and this will be coming online sooner than we expect. And we think that the new system will be operating in practice as in deemed consent, possibly from the end of July. In terms of recommendations to the community, we actually have a call with NHSBT to finalise some things just this week. But the system, I believe, is already operational. So the recommendation would be to members of the community to go online and to sign up. And if you wish to be a donor, do so in confidence, knowing that many people have worked hard on the system from across the community with NHSBT, with the best interests of the community at heart, and that you can sign up to be a donor, noting that you want faith to be considered, and that we have guarantees from NHSBT and clear commitments from the individual donors around the basis upon which they want to donate, which means that effectively it's a tremendous opportunity, whereas people may have wanted to sign up in the past and been reticent, and rightly so. Now they can with confidence, and there's no, as we know, there's no greater gift. And if people are in a position where they can sign up and be donors, then and they feel they want to, then by all means, please do. I would just pick up on one final thing, back to the hearing what Dr. Shub and Professor Warrens were just saying, being on the receiving end of the conversations about organ donation when a loved one has, in tragic circumstances and very suddenly, died, is a very, very tough place to be. And I would therefore, I can only echo and emphasize the importance and the tremendous value in having those conversations and having them early. They can lead to all sorts of wonderful family-related conversations around the importance of life, around values, around celebrating life. It can be a very positive, constructive conversation, as I have seen since within my own family. And all it does is it raises the issues. It means that if the time comes, it's not the first time anybody's thought about it or considered it, and it's something that people instinctively know what to do. And actually, in many ways, it eases the pain and the difficulty and the discomfort and the challenge and the upset and all the awful things that are going on for families at that time. So please have the conversations, discuss them with your loved ones, celebrate life, and go online and sign up to be a donor if you can.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to thank our panel this evening, firstly for their time, giving of their time, and for providing us with a fascinating conversation covering both the halachic and medical aspects of this important issue. So my thanks go to you, Diane Gelly, Professor Warrens, to Dr. Shub, Ari Jesner, and to Dr. Wittenberg. For more information on this subject, please visit joda.org.uk, chiefrabbi.org, and the NHS website. All remains for me to say is to thank you all once again for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thank you.